Hello and welcome to another edition of Here We Are. I'm your host, Tonita Cheatham. Thank you so much for tuning in. In this edition of Here We Are, we're going to talk to you about, or share information with you about how and what they're doing down at the USDA, down on the farm, and in laboratories across the country with our food. We're going to find out what is biotechnology, big word, as it relates to the food that we eat. Now, as more and more of our farmers turn to using different kinds of hybrid products and bringing them to our city grocery store shelves, many of us never give any thought to what kind of tomato or corn or other biotechnology products we are eating. Now, joining me in this very interesting discussion is Mr. Terry Francl of the American Farm Bureau Federation. Thank you for joining us today, Terry.
My pleasure.
What is biotechnology?
Well, biotechnology is an exciting field, Tonita. We have really been accelerating in this area for about the last 10 years, and that's with the advent of genetic modification, where we can now take the genes from different plants and mix them in a combination. We can take particular traits that we've identified, actually even between plants and animals, and develop specialized products that are either easier to raise, more environmentally friendly, use less chemicals and pesticides because they actually develop their own chemicals or their own protection against the insects, and or that have taste or characteristics, the types of proteins, amino acids that help in the processing of these plants and or animals.
Okay, so you're using natural things to create other natural things. How much is synthetic and how much is natural?
Well, when you say natural, that's very hard to define because you have to realize that man has been doing selecting breeding things for thousands of years. You go back to wheat, this started 10, 12,000 years ago, but the earliest records back to the pharaohs in Egypt with the domestication of animals. That process accelerated about 150 years ago when a gentleman by the name of Mendel started identifying what we were doing. But it's a long process where you actually go through and you look at the different plants and or animals and you pick out the ones that have the characteristics you want most. And so it takes generation after generation to develop these, and then you have to breed them. What is exciting about biotechnology is that we can now take the DNA, small parts of the DNA, out of one of these plants and inject it into another. And we can transform those characteristics from the plants to another. Classic example about 6 or 8 years ago was the Flavor Saver tomato that came out. And it was developed in such a way that it would be more viable. Turned out wasn't all that well accepted by consumers because being more viable meant it was a little harder, a little tougher. And so that one didn't work so well. But we've had many, many more products that have been developed since. Most of the emphasis up to this point has been the first generation, and that's helped on the production side with farmers. That's helped them to grow them better with less chemicals, less cost. As we get into second and third generations, now we're starting looking at putting in these genes that are going to make it more flavorful, different colors, make them specially designed for the people.
So you're perfecting the product more. Now, you mentioned tomatoes. What other products are familiar or that you do this kind of technology with?
Well, in terms of those that are directly consumed by consumers, potatoes is one they've had. And there's work in some things as canola. That's what we make one of the cooking oils out of. Soybeans, that's again cooking oils. And of course, you know, there's tofu and some of those. The Japanese use a lot of those products. Some of the corn products we make, and those have genes in them that protect them against insects. And some of the cotton, interestingly enough, also have genes that protect them against insects. They're also developing different kinds of cotton. They can insert genes and they can get certain colors of cotton. Instead of cotton being white, it can actually be grown a natural color.
Okay, that's exciting. That's exciting. Now, is there a difference? I've heard the term biogenetics. is there a difference in the term biogenetics and biotechnology? Or
well, technically, if you're in the field, there may be some subtle differences, but generally, as we talk about GMOs, and that's genetic modified organisms, or biotechnology, those terms are used interchangeably in the normal conversations. So they all represent this manipulation of the genes which develops these plants. It's interesting, once this happens and people see some of these things, of course it raised some questions in some people's minds about this, and it's something that's new and it's different, and of course people need to understand it. And a lot of times we get the stuff, as you indicated at the onset of the program, and we get it in the store and we look at it and we said, hey, where did this come from?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
We don't really appreciate everything behind it.
Now, when it was developed, when this technology was developed, is it solely to protect plants from corrosion or infestation from different insects that may get it? I mean, is it solely for that other purpose?
Well, actually, for the products that we currently have on the market that are commercially grown already, what they call BT corn, and that protects it against an insect that's called a corn borer that actually gets in and will eat the corn or ruin it. So that's an insecticide. It's a natural insecticide, and it's bred into the corn plant. In terms of the soybeans, it's very interesting that they put a gene in there that protects it against a certain kind of herbicide, so that when you spray the herbicide, all the other plants will die, all the weeds will die, but it does not affect the soybeans. Soybeans that don't have this gene in it would die. Mm-hmm. And so what it does, the type of herbicide they use, they can use it in smaller amounts and it's much more effective, so you end up using less cultivation, you have to use less fuel, there's less erosions, a whole lot of real beneficial things. That's the first generation. Now as we get into the second and third generations, now they're doing more of the characteristics. They'll manipulate the kind of protein we have, the kind of amino acids. It'll affect the flavors. We're also, there's another area that's a little different. We've worked in this for a number of years, but that's in the pharmaceutical area. And we can produce plants that have pharmaceutical values that they can use in their medicines. And in fact, that was one of the real early uses of biotechnology, to develop media for some of the things they use for the diabetics. When they develop the insulin, the media that they use to develop that is a biotechnology product. They did that about 10, 12 years ago.
I'm curious, you spoke of the texture and the taste that may be a bit different. What other things with this technology that would make these products different from, I keep saying natural, maybe that's the wrong terminology to use, but a tomato with this type of technology as opposed to tomato not raised that way?
Well,
I'm just curious, are there any kind of side effects, any kind of dangers that we need to be
like anything else, yes. They always want to be on the guard to make sure that there are no adverse side effects. And one of the things that they look for are the allergens. In other words, products that you might be allergic to. For example, peanuts have a lot of allergens. It's interesting, I forget what product it was. They were working on a food product and they were using a gene from the Brazilian nut, and they found out that that was an allergen, and that was never brought to market. Incidentally, the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, tests these products very extensively. They're all, the irony of this is, and while there's concern, and people should understand this, that this is new and different, so it raises some questions. But the irony of it is that these new products have probably been tested much, much more thoroughly than many of the traditional products that we've eaten for years.
How much, or to what percentage on our store shelves, probably unknown to us, I know certainly unknown to me, are there these type of products?
Well, that is difficult to say. A lot of times it's ingredients. It's not the main ingredient, but some additional thing, not necessarily flavorings, but as you look at our products, you'll see there's a whole list of ingredients, and it may not be one of the main ingredients, but there may be some. That's difficult to say. I would, and this is speculation on my part because I've not seen any figures, but my guess would be there's probably somewhere in the area of 10 to 15% of our products have some of this at this juncture.
Do regulations state that you have to mention that on the product?
As long as the products are no different, and I'll use the term you used before, your natural products, as long as the content of it, the protein or the amino acids, as long as that's different, no, it isn't necessary, because in fact it is no different than the, let's use the word conventional products, those that are non-biotech. If for some reason that does change, then that has to be mentioned on the FDA label. Up to this point, I don't believe there's very many. But that is an issue people are discussing as to, regardless whether or not there is a change, whether it should be on the label. The Groceries Manufacturers Association and some others have looked at this issue, and I think where this may be going is that we may develop an identification similar to our organic foods. Organic foods are identified as organic foods. They really are no different in terms of, again, the proteins, the chemical makeup of them. It's just the way they're grown. They do not use synthetic fertilizers or synthetic pesticides. So we're thinking about perhaps identifying foods as being non-biotech. In other words, they would be grown without this. And the others, and this is where it's difficult, because the way we manufacture foods, we put all these ingredients in different products, it's really hard to say. So what we need to do is let the people, the consumers that are buying it know, so if we identify it as a non-biotech, then they'll understand that, just like on the organic foods.
Okay. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after this to talk more about biotechnology. We're back. This is Here We Are, and I'm Tonita Cheatham. And joining me today is Mr. Terry Francl, and he is talking to us about biotechnology. One thing, we have most interesting conversations during the breaks that you were talking about, and I want you to explain it. Usually when you say the word biotechnology, you automatically think, as I was saying, you know, something that's not natural, that's not real. But basically what you're saying is that what you're doing is you're integrating a whole lot of natural products. Am I using the right word when I say natural?
Well, I think that's right. We could say natural, we could say conventional. Basically, you're taking these genes and you're remixing them. Now, going back to where we started early in the program, that's the selective breeding process that happens over a long period of time. And in many respects, you're just accelerating that. Actually, you are defining it, and you are guiding that process through these DNA combinations, with one exception. In nature, you do not have that mixture between plants and animals. And with this DNA process, you can actually take some of the DNA from the animals and put it in plants, or vice versa.
And you were speaking of one particular process.
I think this is really fascinating. And I don't recall if it was a fish or exactly what species it was, but it was an animal species that lives is either in the Arctic or the Antarctic, in the very cold water. And they could take the gene out of that and implant it in plants and allow them to survive at much colder temperatures than they normally would. Usually when it gets below 32 degrees, you know, if you look at the trees and so on, that's when plants stop growing, they lose their leaves and so on. And this gene, by doing this, they can survive in temperatures that are down to, well, 10 degrees or maybe even close to 0-degree temperatures. It's an amazing process.
Why do we not know more about this type of technology? Don't you feel that it would be better embraced if people understood it was more of an integration as opposed to creating something separate from, you know, this product from that product? I mean, don't you think it'd be more acceptable?
Well, it's one of those areas that, as we look back, we can say, you know, we sure should have done a lot more communication with the public about this. The focus has been, as we do in our society, however, there are so many rules and regulations on the safety of the thing. And so that's the focus. And it's been kind of the thing, well, we've met all those rules and regulations. We've proved it safe beyond any doubt. And we kind of go on with life. And as this information starts to come out, the people are saying, well, now wait a second, just what does this mean? We look at this label, we say, it talks about genetic modification or biotechnology. What does all this mean? Well, you're absolutely right that more information should have been given to the public, and we should be doing things just like this program. I think this is a great opportunity to let people know about this.
Thank you so much. When you, I'm trying to get an understanding of exactly what you do. When we're talking about biotechnology, but what type of background does a person have to have in order to do this kind of technology? And I guess that'd be telling kind of what you do, some of your background. So I guess for the lack of, giving a biography.
Well, my background is much different. I'm an economist, and I deal in policy analysis for the American Farm Bureau Federation. This is a very large farm organization in the country, about 5 million members. And so my background is in that. This is one of the special issue areas that I deal with. Typically the people, if you want to talk about the technical people, and I've been in genetic labs, in a couple of genetic labs where they do this, these are people that have degrees in biology, and they actually have degrees in genetics now. This has been going on for about the last 10 years. And they learn how to do these things. Actually, when they implant these genes, they first started doing it, they literally shot them. They used small .22 rifle shells. They put these genes on little bits of gold, little gold pellets, and they shoot them in. They subsequently developed, now there's a compressed gas they use it, but they actually shoot it in there, and then they start growing the material. There's still a selective process in this, but it's people that work in these technical areas, of course. That's how all this comes about.
Wow. Well, the popularity of this type of technology is really catching on in the United States. How popular is it abroad?
Well, it's gotten mixed reviews abroad. In Asia, it's fairly well accepted. Canada and Mexico, it's much like the U.S. There's been relatively little discussion. In Europe, over the past year or so, there's been a movement sponsored by some environmental groups, Greenpeace and the World Federation, against that. And it's basically a concern about it, or at least that's what they say about the safety aspects of it, what would be the long-term environmental impacts. I guess some people are just kind of uncomfortable with the process where you're taking this DNA and mixing it, and they're saying this is unnatural. It's interesting, a lot of players have gotten involved, and in fact, this prompted at one point the Vatican to even issue an announcement and saying, well, we need to know that we don't think that biotechnology is something that's against God or violates any religious. So a lot of different players have gotten in it. But you have to also understand that as we look at our friends in Europe, that when some of these things come up, they're pretty good about adopting things that we think are trade barriers. In other words, they say, well, you can't import American products because of this, that, or so on. We call them non-tariff trade barriers. We've had a long-running dispute with them over beef hormones, something that's been used in this country for, at least, 40 or 50 years. And they had a panel, scientific panel that reviewed it in Europe and said it was okay, and they still don't want to import it.
It's okay, but they don't want to import it.
So in many respects, some of those folks have utilized this idea of the biotech products, and they're using it as a trade barrier. Over some period of time, I suspect we'll negotiate those things out, and that's the way it works.
Let's get back to the farm itself.
Sure.
To implement this kind of technology, it's different from back in the day when you had a farm and you raised products and you sent them to the resale, to sell, to get to the end consumer. You have to be a bit more sophisticated in order to keep up with the current trends.
Oh, no question about it. In one sense, it really isn't that much different. I mean, we introduced hybrid corn about 70 years ago, back in the 30s. And that was really the first step of what's just been a series of developments that's resulted in where we are now. The thing that is really different is that as we develop these products, they probably won't go into the bulk market. Now, in some of the early ones we have, because they were just, they affect the growing characteristics, the ability to withstand weeds or insects, so on. But as we get in these characteristics for humans, it means that we'll probably want to identity preserve them. In other words, when you buy the seed, you're probably also going to be negotiating with the person that's going to be doing the processing. Some of this is done. For example, right now, some of the Japanese will buy certain kinds of soybeans, and when the farmers harvest them, instead of putting them in the truck and hauling them to town in the elevator, they put them in containers right in the field. Those containers are shipped to the processing plant, be it here in the United States. Some of them are actually put on ships and shipped overseas to Japan. The point is that the whole marketing process will be different. These are going to be very customized type of products. So that's part of what agriculture is in developing, and we just simply do it a little different.
How far are you pulling away from the use of pesticides in your agriculture?
Okay, well, let me go back to this idea of the Bt corn, the one I was talking about that protects against the pest we call corn borer. About 38% of the corn crop in the United States last year was planted to this Bt corn. And this basically eliminates the need for this one kind of pesticide. I can't tell you how much it is in quantity terms other than by eliminating this, it would amount to a lot. Eventually, as we do this, we will probably reduce, we have the potential for cutting the pesticide use in half or maybe even to a fourth. I doubt if we can ever get completely away with it, because there's always some things that kind of crop up at the last minute. But certainly it can be reduced by a significant amount.
How many genetically modified products are there being approved? Is it something approved every year, or it takes a longer process in order for that to happen?
Well, it's an ongoing approval process. In terms of the different commodities, the different crops, there's probably about 12 or 15, maybe even getting close to 20 different crops that have genetically modified seeds available. And this does go through a regulatory approval process, both here in the U.S. and overseas. I happen to know the number over in Europe. There's about 30 different varieties that are approved over in Europe. This is corn, soybeans, canola, some of those things. So, same way in Japan. Japan has been reviewing. I think there's about a similar number that have been approved for sale in Japan. So it varies where you go in the world, and it's accelerating. I mean, as we speak, there's probably literally dozens that are in the process of being developed in various stages of the approval chain.
How many groups would you estimate that are vocal against the use of this kind of technology? Are there a lot?
There's probably a relatively small number of groups. Most of them are environmental groups. You know, in terms of numbers of people, the groups that I know of, probably a dozen or so that would do this. It's interesting. A lot of these groups, it's not necessarily the process themselves that they're against. Some have indicated they're just kind of against big business doing this, and so those type of protests. In fact, there's a group called Concerned Citizens, and they have a scientist, and this person has said, well, we realize that there's been absolutely no evidence that there's any health problems or anything with them, but we're concerned about the long-term use if we do this, and so on and so forth. Admittedly, as a scientist, one could never say we're 100%. No, you just can't do this. Statistically, you can't do this. But the testing and so on has made it, you know, it's 99.99 something, the safety on these things. And again, I emphasize it's much higher. We've had experience with a couple of, use your word, natural again, or conventional products that have been brought in the last decade or so, or two. One is the rat eyes, or the emu or ostrich meat that's been brought in, and that's certainly something different to our population here in the United States. And the other is a fruit plant called kiwi, and those were brought in. I'm not aware of any problems with the rat eyes or the emus or the ostrich, but it is a much different makeup in terms of the protein, and we seem to do that. With the kiwi plant, it turns out that is a pretty highly allergenic, and I have some personal experience in it, and it turns out my wife happened to be allergic to that and has a very adverse reaction. The point I'm trying to make here is that even in nature, sometimes we react to it. You know, people have allergies. Peanuts is another one that's been talked about quite a bit. So, but these plants are tested quite extensively, so this will not happen. And to the extent they ever find this, they're taken off the market.
Okay. Well, we are pretty much at the end of this segment, but if a person wants to know more about biotechnology, how would they get in touch with your organization?
Well, call the American Farm Bureau Federation, area code 847. The number is 685-8769. I'm going to give my number on the phone for the phone, and we'll get some information out to
Well, thank you so much, Terry, for coming and talk to us about this interesting technology. And thank you. We'll be right back after this.